Take the trailer. It's all you deserve." The words landed like a stone. They were small, ordinary syllables. They lodged in Maria Benedita's chest like a fist. Around the kitchen table, the room narrowed and the voices grew thin with the cheap politeness of people who had already decided the shape of each other's lives. Rodrigo sat with his palms flat on the wood, as if steadying himself against the small wound he was inflicting. His wife, Beatriz, smiled like someone who had practiced pleasure at another's expense. Marta, the mother-in-law, looked away from Maria as if she could avoid the mess of memory in her eyes. They had come to divide the household after Antonio's funeral, papers crossed and signatures prearranged, every polite phrase a stitch tightening around what the family had already resolved. Maria had expected grief. She had not expected the speed with which grief would be translated into judgment. In the days after the service, they had repackaged decades of marriage into a thin envelope of obligation, stamped it insufficient, and handed her a key. On the table, beside the cup that still smelled of cold coffee, a small, rusty key clinked and spun. Marta pushed it forward like a verdict. "It's yours," she said. "The trailer, the things you brought, you can go." Maria's fingers closed around the key as if it might be warm. The metal bit into her palm with a faint, oily stick of rust. The ring of the key did not look like heirloom. It looked like a joke. Her suitcase was small, the familiar worn leather that had cradled a life of small miracles. A pair of Antonio's shirts folded with the tenderness she kept in the hollow of her hands. A handful of old photographs. The pair of glasses she wore to read. She slid the suitcase shut, and something in the room shifted. Someone cleared their throat. Someone invented a reason to be busy. It was as though every one of them had rehearsed leaving her alone, and were now applauding their own efficiency. For 25 years she had been the axis around which the house spun. She had managed bills, kept 1,000 little accounts of warmth. Antonio had been the man who could spend and disappear. She had been the woman who would bring him back. Now, after his funeral, there was a ledger, and it did not balance in her favor. She left before the afternoon sun could soften the glare on the road. The trailer sat a few fields away from the old farmhouse, a sun-bleached box of metal and wood, with a porch that bowed like an apology. The paint had long ago surrendered to weather. The door tried to close on its own, and failed. Inside was a smell like old rain, mold, faded soap, the faint sourness of a life wound tight inside 2 small rooms. The heater rattled like a tired animal. Her hands left smudges on the thin curtains as she drew them aside. A pair of moth-eaten curtains divided what had been a marriage from what would be a season of loneliness. She slept with the suitcase beside her. At night, she listened to the rattling of what was left of her life, and to the distant hum of the highway that had once brought her neighbors from the town market. She woke each morning with a chest full of small, sharp questions. Who had been the keeper of the keys in her home? What had Antonio taken with him when he left the room? When the wind sighed, it sounded as if the house were keeping its breath, as if even the walls were uncertain what to do with the absence. Carmen came on the second day, balancing a thermos and 2 chipped cups. Carmen had lived 3 trailers down and ran her hands over the seam of a tea towel like a woman who remembered everything by touch. She folded her muffler into her palms and sat on the rickety mailbox. "People always forget," she said, "how much weight there is in silence. You don't have to carry it alone, Maria." Carmen's voice was a harbor. She did not pretend the scandal had not happened. She named it plainly. The loud bargains, the papers, the way cousins and siblings suddenly found the urgency of their schedules more important than the woman who had put supper on the table for years. Carmen had been at the funeral. She'd watched the faces and seen the easy cruelty that sometimes lives inside families like a parasite. "You should come by," Carmen said gently, unscrewing the thermos. "There are old men who remember Antonio when he was young. He used to bury things. Funny little things. Some called him stingy. Others said he just liked mysteries." Maria blinked. Antonio burying things? The idea felt like a child's tale, absurd and possible inside a life you thought you knew. Buried where? She asked. On the property. He liked to hide things. Coins, old papers, once an old watch. I thought it was nonsense. But when you get a son who would give a trailer as inheritance, maybe there was more to it than nonsense. Carmen folded her hands. If you want, I'll tell you what I heard. Maria did not know whether curiosity or desperation tugged harder at her. The humiliations, Rodrigo's half-smile, the way Beatrice arranged chairs as if she were staging a small triumph, had a way of reshaping the edges of her world. The key felt heavier the longer she held it. She walked in the morning light back to the trailer and stood on the sagging porch, the small key warm in her fist. The wind smelled of hay and distant engines. She put the key in her pocket. The next morning, while she swept a floor that refused to surrender dust, something caught on the bristles of her broom. A scrap of fabric, stitched in a way she did not remember, came loose from a corner near the stove. She picked at it out of habit, some small domestic code she could still obey. And beneath the linoleum, the wood was different. The panel was slightly discolored, as if it had been hidden from sun for a long time. Her fingers found a latch, the exact shape of a secret hiding place. The golden key, the small key from the kitchen, warmed like a sun in her palm. It slipped into the latch with a reluctant, perfect fit. The metal turned with a sound like a tiny lock exhaling. A square of wood lifted and opened a shallow cavity filled with dust the color of old pages. At the bottom, wrapped in greasy cloth, was a small metal box. It was older than she expected, its edges work-worn by hands who had wrapped and unwrapped it a dozen times. The lid stuck of old varnish, and when she pried it open, the world changed around her. Inside sat a sprinkle of stones, the color of sky and fire. They were not merely beautiful, they were wrong in the way treasure is wrong when found in a place meant for socks and old grocery lists. There were rubies, deep as soaked cherries, a handful of emeralds blazing with a green that reminded her of the river near Antonio's childhood farm, polished stones she had seen in shop windows when they had pretended to be rich enough once to stop in and buy a gift. Alongside the stones lay a yellowing envelope stamped with an appraisal, a small certificate that named each gem in blunt, deliberate words. Cut, carat, origin. Whoever had wrapped them knew how to speak the language of value. She stared until her eyes blurred. The box felt like a small altar. She could have laughed. She could have wept until the world emptied. Instead, she sat down on the step and held the lid open, as if watching the slow breathing of some animal that had finally been caught. The stones clicked softly when she moved them, a tiny language of possibility. If Antonio had hidden this, he had done it with a devotion that was not only secret, but ritual. She thought of the days he had been absent, the money that had come and gone, the nights he had left with pockets full and returned with pockets empty. She had made excuses for him, small mercies of explanation. She had believed in the man who came home and told her he would make everything right tomorrow. The discovery was a bright betrayal. It answered and complicated questions. The gambling, the phantom debts, the whispered loans. It did not make the pain easier. It made it more honest. That afternoon, with the trailer's thin glass catching the sky like a distant promise, Maria wrapped the box in its cloth and shoved it back into the cavity. She replaced the panel, the lock closed with a satisfied click. She looked at the small suitcase next to her, at the few shirts folded neat as vows. The stone sat inside the trailer like a sun that had not yet risen. She could take them and go to the bank. She could shout to the family the way Rodrigo had shouted to her, wielding a final humiliation like a cane. But the air around her felt not like fuel for vengeance, but like a map she didn't yet know how to read. That night she dreamt of chambers, rooms of her life opening like drawers. Antonio stood in an orchard with pockets full of pebbles that gleamed faintly, and when she asked him why, he only shrugged. For safekeeping, he told her, a boy telling a secret. She woke with the taste of dirt in her teeth and the ache of the possibility that these stones could be the thin thread holding a future together. She did not tell Carmen right away. Instead, she began to move at a new pace. Patient, deliberate, as if she had stepped into a long game. She took a photograph with her phone, but did not post it. She placed the box back under the floor and walked away from it as if she were leaving a sleeping child. At night, she slept with the lid of the suitcase as a kind of guardian. Neighbors whispered. Word traveled like smoke between trailers and over fences. Some came with condolences. Some came with something that looked like the second-hand approval of people who love the drama of someone else's misfortune. Rodrigo called a week later, his voice smooth, and asked if she was all right, as if one could measure all right by 5 syllables down a phone line. He offered help that had the subtler edge of control. She said she was functioning. She said she appreciated it. But people who do dishonest work often leave fingerprints where you would not expect them. When a young man with a pair of headphones and an earnest smile arrived on her porch one morning, asking after the old house, Maria felt invisible threads tightening. He walked the edges of the yard with a small, nifty machine that beeped now and then, the sound of curiosity made invisible. He pretended to be checking his friend's fence. He asked casual questions. "Is there anything you're looking after?" he said. He did not look like he intended harm, but he looked like someone who wanted the map before you had found the X. She did not reveal anything. She practiced a face that looked empty and uninteresting, because it was the safest face to keep in the light. But behind that face, a new thing was forming. A ledger of small facts, an inventory of what she needed to know and what she would not share. She marked the man's car in her head. She asked herself impossible questions about what it would mean to hold treasure and not be defined by it. When she finally told Carmen, it was at dusk, with the trailer's lamp guttering like a nervous candle. Carmen's hands trembled as she held the photograph of the stones. "I told you there were stories," she said. "Not for the likes of Rodrigo, I thought. Graceless people don't respect a map. They prefer what's obvious." "Do you think they knew?" Maria asked. The question felt thin in her mouth. Did they know she had been given a poor woman's dismissal only to leave with what had been stockpiled under their noses for years? Carmen shrugged in a way that was both compassionate and full of small fury. People see what they want. Sometimes they let it pass right under their feet. But if they did know, if they did, it means they also believed they could decide who deserves what. The word deserves hung between them like a bell. It was a bell the world had chimed for Maria in a dozen shaming ways. She had been told what she deserved and what she did not. Now she held something that could answer those dictates. But answers, she realized, had to be shaped with care. She had the right to a life that was not defined by someone else's contempt. She had the right to the dignity of choosing what to do with what she found. But dignity, she had learned, does not grow in the wild. It needed tending, and enemies would come if they smelled money where hunger had been. They began small. That first weekend, under the hush of a sky that tasted of rain, Maria pried up another board. This one was rougher to the touch. The key turned heavy in the lock, but the compartment offered up an envelope packed tight with bank receipts, a folded page of numbers, and a name. The handwriting was Antonio's, slanted, impatient, and the page was organized in a way only someone keeping the count would understand. There were notes, dates, sums, the names of places. There was no neat explanation of why he had hidden the gems and the receipts, only the tacit confession that some things had been set aside, perhaps for a rainy day, perhaps for an embarrassment he could no longer face. A rhythm took hold of Maria's days. She would wake before the trailer had learned the shape of the morning and move with quiet hands, the kind of hands that could fold a shirt without creasing its memory. In the small hours, when the air inside the trailer held the hush of keeping secrets, she would lift a panel and look. She found small ledgers, a watch with the initials AM. On the back, a stack of old coins wrapped in oilcloth, papers stamped with a collector's mark that suggested value not simply sentimental, but real. Each found object was a small proof that the life she had been pushed out of had contained hidden economies, not just of money, but of choices kept away from her. It was as if parts of Antonio had been living in a second life of secrecy. Once she had seen the first handful of jewels, the idea of leaving them under a crooked floor began to make her skin itch. She told herself she would not run to the bank, to the headlines, to public claims. She was not a woman who wanted spectacle. She wanted to know first. Who had known? Why had they done nothing? And if they had known, was there a legal thread that had been frayed and stitched badly, or had someone deliberately folded her into a corner? She found, tucked in the lining of an old leather coat, a map. It was crudely drawn, the ink bleached at the edges by time, and the hands of someone who had once traced things with the careful curiosity of a child at play. The map was not grand. It was the kind of map a person draws for their own memory. A tree, the well, a little X beside the trailer's foundation. There were marks along the path, stones, a small circle for a fence post. Whoever had drawn it wanted to be able to find the hiding places again. They wanted the treasure to be retrievable, but invisible to the casual eye. Maria kept the map folded in her shirt the way you keep a secret prayer. At night, she dreamed of digging, of the smell of earth and the cold bite of metal. Each find teased a hypothesis into being. Maybe Antonio had planned to leave them to her and could not in life. Maybe others in the house had been complicit. Maybe the family's decision to push her out was not only greed, but a way to keep what they judged their own. Rumors are like iron filings. They gather around the things that move. Within a week, someone mentioned in a church line that the family had been loudly pursuing papers to clear the land. A municipal notice landed like a late-season leaf, inked with the municipal clerk's official hand and threatening a review of property conditions, including derelict trailers. It called for compliance within 48 hours or risked condemnation. The notice carried the efficient coldness of paperwork. It was the kind of threat that smelled like someone trying to engineer an eviction with a neat official stamp. Rodrigo's text that night was short and almost solicitous. "You know I'm looking out for you," it said. But it was the daily visits from men with small machines and polite smiles that marked the new change. One morning he stood at the edge of the trailer yard, holding a detector and a thermos, pretending to check for uneven fences. His voice was easy, casual, too casual. "You could move closer to town, Mom," he said. "We could help. There are options." He said, "help," like an admission of authority. Maria watched him from the doorway, the photograph of the stones folded in her breast pocket like a small bone for strength. He walked the perimeter as though the earth beneath his feet were a ledger he could balance with the sweep of a hand. When he left, Rodrigo flashed his smile at Beatriz, as if congratulating her on the successful performance of the morning. Maria felt a cold clarity settle. This was not merely about objects, it was about narrative. Who would tell the story of what had happened to Antonio's savings? Who would be allowed to redeem his memory with the right words? Who would shape the paper trail? People like Rodrigo had a way of transforming grief into an accounting advantage. She had been given the trailer as a final humiliation, a public sentence that disguised itself as generosity. The stones, the papers, the maps under the floor made that sentence look foolish and small. She began to keep a journal in a small notebook she carried in her apron. She cataloged what she found, the dates, the locations beneath the trailer, and she wrote down the men who came to measure her life like a commodity. Her handwriting trembled at first, but grew steadier with each entry. She put pins in a mental map of the people who mattered. Carmen, the neighbor who carried a thermos and a memory, the young man with the headphones, the gentleman from town who had been foreman on her father-in-law's land many years ago, who might remember things about Antonio's habits. On a wet morning, with fog eating the edges of the road, Maria pried up the biggest panel she had found yet. She worked slowly, breathing damp air into her cheeks, the motions precise, like a seamstress mending a seam that had been ripped. She dug with a small trowel, the earth soft and smelling of roots. The trowel struck metal. Her chest tightened. She scraped away grit and revealed the rounded lip of a box much older than the first. The clasp protested like a throat clearing. Inside, wrapped in oiled cloth, were a stack of stones and a small booklet of documents, appraisals, a list of names, and folded small and private, a note written in Antonio's hand. The note read, "If anything should happen to me, these are for you. Keep them safe. I'm sorry for the nights I stole from our days." The apology was a break in the dam. Maria sat with the paper in her lap and the box on the floor of the trailer. The words were both balm and brand. They meant Antonio had known, had meant, maybe, to leave this for her, had intended, perhaps, to repair what he had broken by hiding. But the documents, appraisals and a ledger, also suggested someone had taken liberties with public records, that this was not the quiet possession of a man, but the kind of object that entered the world as a thing to be accounted for. A dog barked in the distance. The sky cleared as if obliging her clarity. Sunlight spilled thin and honest across the trailer floor. Maria wrapped the note in cloth and put it in her apron. She felt an army of small decisions forming in her chest. Her mind was not yet strategy. It was cataloging grief and righteous indignation. She did not think of revenge. She thought of rightness. She thought of an old plain word, justice. But what did justice look like when the scales had been tipped by those who cared more for pretense than for truth? The trailer's thin walls had ears. They also had neighbors with eyes. Word travels on barbed wires and through garden fences. By the time she found the second cache, someone else had begun to circle. A shadow at the end of the lane made itself known in the form of a parked car and two figures who scanned the ground with a pair of detectors. They moved with a professional casualness that made Maria's palms clammy. She watched them from the window as they methodically swept the soil like men sweeping floors. The detectors booped and hummed, and once, a tone rose too close for comfort. She stepped onto the porch, the small box hidden under her coat, the coins in her pocket like a heart beating. Rodrigo's silhouette leaned against the car, arms folded, a kingly slouch. "Find anything?" he called, voice smooth. Beatrice stood by his side like a duchess ready for a photograph. They were not interested in conversation. They were conducting a ritual of possession. "You always did have a way of finding things," Rodrigo said, and the mockery flickered like a small flame. Maria felt something in her rise that was neither anger nor triumph. It was the pure, cold clarity of someone who knows she is not alone. She walked down the porch steps slowly, the boards skeptical beneath her feet. She met Rodrigo's eyes. There was no performance in her face now. There was a steady, unmasked countenance she had not used in public for a long time. "You don't need to do this," she said. The words were simple. She could have said more, threats, accusations, the kinds of things that would have made a better story, but she kept to small truths. Everything on this land belongs to those who live here. Rodrigo's smile hardened like a coin clipped. "We're just checking, Mom. For safety, for the record." He gestured to the men with detectors as if they were municipal auditors. Permission sought, permission given. A beep insistently rose from the collars of the men at the fence. They walked a circle and then stooped. One of them reached for a patch of grass and began to scrape. Maria's fingers itched. She could call the police, she could call a lawyer, but none of those things would happen in the neat rhythm of a morning in a country where family problems were often folded up and hidden beneath polite dinners. She held back. She had not yet decided what to do with what she had found. She wanted to gather facts, to make sure that when she acted, the ground under Rodrigo's feet would not be habitable. For the first time since Antonio's funeral, she began to think like someone who had rights that extended beyond the courtesy of relatives. She was not only a woman in a trailer, she was a keeper of proof, a woman with a map and a ledger and a name once married to a man who had not trusted himself. As the men scraped and beeped, Rodrigo turned his head and caught sight of the small box. Of course he could not know it was the box tucked away under the panel, and for a second the expression on his face was not triumph, but a thin calculation. He had not expected the earth to answer so quickly. He had not expected that the land would cough up secrets before he had stamped them into his tidy narrative. He ran his hand through his hair and said something to Beatrice, and Beatrice laughed in that small, high way that carried a sound like glass breaking. Maria stepped between them and the men. She did not raise her voice. Her hands were steady. She felt the coolness of the trailer key in her pocket like an anchor. "You should not be digging here," she said. "This is private." "Private!" Rodrigo's voice came quick, as if offended to be lectured in a place where he thought himself the judge. "This is family property. We're family." "We were family," Marta had told her the day she left. Maria realized the phrase had the brittle taste of finality. "We were" was the thin sheet of ice on which they had pushed her out. Now the men's detectors thrummed like an insect, and the land remembered what had been left in it. It was then that Maria understood she had to choose. She could shout, she could flee, she could call for help, and raise the kind of scene that would send people scurrying like birds. Or she could step quiet and collect proof, thread the map with her own hand, gather allies who knew how to read the language of law and not only the language of possession. She thought of Carmen's thermos, of the old men who remembered Antonio in his thrift and odd tenderness. She thought of the note folded in his hand, the apology that had lived like a small confession in the dark. She thought of how humiliating it had been to be handed a trailer and a key as if that sum of grief could be measured like change. The map in her shirt warmed against her ribs as if it too recognized the shape of a new decision. The man with the detector scraped deeper, and the sound of metal revealed itself. He pulled up something clotted with roots, an old canister, an iron tin corroded at the edges. He looked up, and the quiet that had been gathering in Maria's bones swelled into a readiness. Rodrigo's smugness did not know the look of someone who had lost their right to shape a life. He said something to the men about calling the municipality, about official channels. It sounded tidy and inevitable, a bureaucratic rhythm designed to smooth inconvenient truths. Maria put her hand on the small panel at her feet, palms flat on the worn wood. The key in her pocket felt like a witness. "We will not let them take what is ours," she said, and the words were not a plea nor a threat. They were the clear, clean sound of a woman staking out a life. For a moment there was stillness. Then the man with the detector straightened, his machine beeped angrily, and Rodrigo moved his lips as if rehearsing a line. The sun cut the dust into gold, and the field smelled of wet earth. The story had bent. A pivot was happening beneath the skin of a small town. Maria felt it, the slow turn from being put to the side toward being accounted for. She walked back into the trailer with the small box wrapped under her shirt. The case clicked softly with each step. She placed it on the table and took off her scarf. In the window the men circled the ground like circling birds. She made tea with a careful hand and did not cry then. She waited. She would gather the facts first. She would call no one yet. She would piece together the map and the ledgers before she shouted their names into the light. Carmen came in that evening and sat with her in the dim light. They spread the map between them, aged lines like the folds in a face. The names and numbers sighed from the paper like small histories. Carmen's face was grave, steady in the way of those who had practiced endurance. "You must be careful," Carmen said. "People change when money is in the middle. They can be desperate, or they can pretend to be kind while they pry your hands open." "I don't want to be cruel to them," Maria answered. The words surprised her. They were not pity for the family. They were the grammar of the woman she had always been, conflicted, reluctant to wield pain as a weapon. "I just want what's right." Carmen nodded. "That is not cruel. That is necessary." They traced the map with their fingers. Where the ink marked with a hesitant X, there were other notches. The pattern suggested a rhythm, small caches, a habit of scattering what someone could not trust to a bank. It suggested a man who had loved secrecy, who had tolerated his own recklessness by building a second economy at the borders of his life. It suggested that for all the outward things Rodrigo and Beatrice had done, There were truths under the floorboards that had the power to make their arrogance look thin. That night, Maria locked the trailer door and crawled between thin sheets. The small box sat under the table like a quiet heartbeat. She stared at the low ceiling and thought of the funeral table, the faces that had given her a key as if to say she had been measured. The map was folded in the breast of her shirt, like a promise or a threat. She did not yet know which. Outside, the detectors hummed once more. The men's figures moved with the polite patience of those who wish to be thought lawful. Rodrigo's voice carried over the hum of cicadas as he explained the municipal notice to a neighbor who had wandered to the fence. He was confident as a man who believes the law is his friend when its hand serves his interests. Inside the trailer, Maria pressed the small metal box to her chest and felt the coolness of the metal through the cloth. The stones inside did not make her rich. They made her a keeper of the truth. And truth, she had learned, does not wear a crown. It has teeth, yes, and it can bite, but more often it shapes the space between people so that choices become visible. She slept and woke ready. The world outside was the world of the next step, proof, perhaps witnesses, perhaps the tacit help of those who would not let her be dismissed as easily again. Her humiliation had been public. Her dignity would need to be stubborn, private, and precise. The trailer, the very thing Rodrigo had offered as an insult, had become a small fortress that housed not only her memories, but the answers that could transform a humiliation into a claim. When the men with the detector came back the next morning, Maria had a plan that was not yet a strategy. She had the box, the map, the note. She had Carmen and a list of neighbors who remembered Antonio's habit with a reverent mixture of irritation and fondness. She had no lawyer, no official seal, no headline, only the quiet gravity of someone prepared to keep a secret until it could be turned into evidence. Rodrigo, standing at the trailer gate with a new rattle of confidence, did not know that his afternoon of casual indignation had become the starting line of a quiet resistance. He thought that he could stage a small drama, produce a few men with polite machines, and tidy the edges of his discomfort by reconfirming a narrative in which he was the adult and Maria the dependent. She opened the door, and the sunlight, bright and flat, found her face with all its years of stories. She folded the map, put the key on the table, and walked out to meet them. Her steps were slow, but they carried an inner velocity, a movement toward something neither petty nor passive. The detectors sounded like a distant storm. The men worked the soil. Maria watched them with a quiet that had teeth. She carried an old ledger she had found in Antonio's coat, the one with names and dates, tucked under her arm. It felt like something heavy with obligations. She held it up for no one in particular, and then, when Rodrigo sauntered close, she let the edges show. He noticed the book and smirked. "Going to read to yourself, Mom?" "No," she said. "I'm going to remember." His mouth tightened. The land around them hummed. The story that would shape the next weeks was only beginning. The detectors beeped more furiously. One of the men stooped, and his hand closed on something in the dirt. He lifted his find, and it was, not a metal tin this time, but the edge of an old iron clasp, the corner of a box corroded black. Rodrigo straightened, as if pulled by an unseen string. Beatrice looked at him, eyes bright with a triumph she had rehearsed in private. The field smelled faintly of damp earth and the prospect of reckoning. Maria felt neither elation nor fear. She felt a readiness sharpen into a purpose. She tucked the ledger into her apron and walked toward the men, toward the soil, toward the thing that would force the conversation into a new grammar. She had been humiliated, handed a trailer, asked to be small. Now, with the map in her hands and the stones under her floor, she was no longer willing to be a footnote. She would name what was true. She would not brandish vengeance. She would keep to the law of proof. She would show how dignity can be recovered not through the collapse of others, but by revealing what had been hidden. The men finished prying the rusty corner free and exposed a box similar to the one she had found beneath her floor. Their hands shook when they thumbed away the dirt. Rodrigo's face was a study in disbelief. He had expected the ground to be empty. Instead, the earth had presented a puzzle, and Maria held the key to its solution. She did not shout. She did not cry. She only watched the small box be lifted, felt the weight of choices pressing like a slow tide. The trailer's air held the metallic scent of buried things. The men's detector gave a long, complaining tone, and then silence. The land had decided to speak. Rodrigo's jaw worked. He looked over at Maria with something like accusation and then with something like fear. The man who had handed her a trailer as if it were the final score of a marriage now realized there might be a different score altogether. He had told the world what she deserved. The world, however, had other ideas. Maria opened the door of the trailer and went in for the small metal box she had kept hidden on the shelf. She set it on the table between them, a quiet, deliberate act, and left it uncovered. The gems inside lay like honest eyes. The ledger beside them breathed the names and dates of a life that had been counted differently than others would have it. Rodrigo cleared his throat. "This is ridiculous," he began. His voice wanted the authority of law without the expense of truth. Maria leaned in and said, with a calm that was not fragile, "These are answers." For the first time since her life narrowed into a suitcase and a key, she felt the outlines of a future that might be authored by her own steady hand. The land had yielded something more than stones. It had yielded a choice. And she, who had been told what she deserved in a sneer, was about to decide what to do with what she had been given. Outside, a municipal truck idled at the side of the road, an official notice folded flat on the dashboard, and a neighbor watched with the careful interest of someone who knows that sometimes small towns must be reminded that the past carries weight. The men with detectors held the earth like a question. Rodrigo tightened his grip on an invented righteousness. Maria lifted the small box and, with neither triumph nor malice, placed it gently on the porch. The sun struck the gems, and they flashed like small confessions. She realized then that whatever would follow, the letters, the lawyers, the municipal notices, would be a long and careful untying of knots. She would not be lonely in her work. Carmen's hands would be there. The ledger would speak. There would be witnesses who remembered scrabbles of childhood and the way Antonio would hide his things. She sat down. She sat down with the small metal box before her, its weight like a private sentence. The stones inside caught the thin afternoon and fractured it into bright, impossible pieces. For a long time, she did nothing but let light and silence do their slow work. Then she smoothed the ledger's pages with a reverence that felt almost like prayer. If you want to see how she turned humiliation into power, stay with us. Carmen pressed her palms flat on the table as if she, too, could steady what had been unearthed. "We need someone who understands paper," she said quietly. "Not a man who signs with a smile, but someone who reads the way ink tells truth." Maria nodded. It was not flattery that made the name rise in her mind. It was memory. Dr. Augusto's face, calm and direct, from a church fundraiser where he had once offered counsel to a neighbor. He had a reputation for honesty in the town, a careful person who would not confuse help with conquest. The next morning, after the men with detectors had gone and the sun had polished the grass into brief gold, Maria took the ledger, the appraisal, the note in Antonio's hand, and walked the long lane into town. The municipal offices smelled of copier toner and bureaucracy. The clerk took a careful interest when she said she wanted to speak to a lawyer known for fairness. Dr. Augusto arrived at the trailer within 2 days. He was not theatrical. He parked at the gate, folded his hands as if to fold the world into a more manageable shape, and came in with a kindness that did not pretend the truth would be easy. He listened without interruption as Maria spread the map and the ledger and the note on his small clinic's desk. He examined the appraisal stamps with a quiet intensity. His fingers never hurried. "There's enough here to demand answers," he said at last, looking up. "Not because of the stones themselves, but because of the records. Whoever kept accounts and hid things also left a track. That track can protect you." "What do you mean?" Maria asked. She had thought protection meant someone standing between her and her family's ambitions. He used a different word. "Proof," he said. "Paper ties time to people. If those papers are real, and if they link these things to Antonio, then you have the beginning of a legal claim. If someone tries to override that claim with forged documents, the forgery itself becomes a weapon against them. But we must be careful. Move with method, not noise. The law doesn't like improvisation, and neither does the town when it wants a tidy exit." He did not promise a quick end. He spoke of investigations, of administrative notices, of the possibility that the municipality's inspector might be used as an ally or as an obstacle. He named the risks, that forged renunciations could appear, that the family might file false complaints, that a court might be slow. Maria listened, her throat tight, but she felt less like a person waiting for permission and more like someone with a plan to follow. Dr. Augusto arranged to have the documents authenticated. He called a friend at the appraisal office in the city. He asked discreet questions of the municipal registry, and, with a gentle directness, he suggested a guard of witnesses, neighbors who would testify they had seen nobody remove anything from the trailer or that they had seen Antonio hide things in the past. Carmen agreed, of course. At the market, a retired foreman gave a careful affidavit about Antonio's habit of tucking away coins. Small people with small memories became the scaffolding of proof. The family did not remain passive. When they realized Maria was not going to be a silent tenant in their tidy narrative, Rodrigo adopted a new face, conciliatory and clipped with the practiced efficiency of someone used to steering conversations. He called her often, offering to help with paperwork and make things easier. Beatriz kept her distance publicly and posted the right photos on the right socials about doing charity work while quietly questioning anyone who lingered by the trailer. Marta vacillated. She visited with a plate of soup, eyes quick to the floor, hands that trembled when she folded napkins. Dr. Sylvia appeared like a storm. The family retained her, a polished lawyer from the city with a voice that carried both charm and an impatience for sentiment. She visited the trailer once, a quick inspection under the pretext of family reconciliation. Her smile was trained. Her briefcase contained an empire of practice. She spoke of municipal codes and of complications, and left with a promise that she would help Rodrigo find a practical way forward. In the week that followed, letters began to arrive. Official-looking pages stamped by the municipality cited safety concerns with the trailer and required an inspection within 48 hours unless immediate remediation was shown. A second envelope bore a notarized-looking statement, a renunciation of inheritance signed with Maria's name, renouncing claims to any property beyond the trailer, dated and witnessed. Maria had not signed anything. Her throat closed at the sight of the neat signature that claimed her silence. Dr. Augusto examined the papers with a slow, careful eye. "They'll try to take the easy route," he told her. "They will build a paper castle and hope you knock. But forgeries leave mistakes. Someone who fakes calm forgets how people write when they are tired. We'll get a handwriting expert if we must, but first we catalog. We document everything you found, where you found it, who saw you find it. We put the story together the way the law likes it, in order." They filed a notice with the municipal clerk, a simple, factual statement that Maria had found property of value on the parcel and that she had documents and witnesses. The clerk received them with a professional curiosity. Someone later asked whether they could expedite an inspection. Dr. Augusto smiled and said, "We'd appreciate speed. Speed in this case would mean keeping the ground undisturbed until the facts could be recorded." Rodrigo and Beatriz escalated in subtler ways. A man from a local auction house called to ask if the trailer contained items they might consider letting to the market. Another, using a friend-of-a-friend route, hinted at a buyer for family heirlooms. Maria kept her face as calm as the day she turned the key in the panel and found the first box. Inside, she made lists. She continued to catalog finds without attempting to sell, to give, or to hide. The community watched at a distance that was often too close. Some saw a widow reclaiming what was hers. Others whispered of scandal. The church's pastor invited everyone to a luncheon under the pretext of mediating a family solution. Maria declined, unwilling to let grief be folded into someone else's neat ending. Marta's visits grew shorter and more frequent. She stood at the doorway and apologized for dishes that had cooled on the table and for the times she had looked away. Then something happened that shifted the axis of the town. A local journalist, nosing for a human interest piece, heard the rumor through a friend of a friend and decided the story would be about a widow and a trailer and the small ironies of life. She came with a polite camera and a notebook and asked to talk to Maria. Maria said no. She had no desire for publicity, and she had learned that attention could be a kind of theft when wielded by the wrong hands. Instead, Dr. Augusto asked the journalist to hold her peace and to meet with him. He explained only the minimum, that his client had found personal property with documents that suggested the deceased had hidden assets and that a family dispute had arisen. He asked that the reporter delay publication until the legal facts could be established. The journalist, who liked a clean narrative, agreed, partly because Dr. Augusto's calm made the story seem cleaner, and partly because, in small towns, delay often serves the side that seeks to tidy things quickly. On a morning thick with rain, a municipal inspector arrived with a clipboard and an efficient air. He inspected the trailer, noted necessary repairs, but he also recorded that there was an ongoing civil dispute about the property's contents. He made an official note that the trailer would not be condemned pending further investigation. The brief relief that followed felt like a drawbridge being raised, not safe, but not abandoned. Rodrigo, sensing that formal channels might be slipping from his best-laid plan, changed tack. He and Beatriz arranged a family meeting at the farmhouse, formal and plush, where they intended to produce the kind of theater of reconciliation that often precedes the quiet stealing of other people's rights. They invited Maria. She accepted the invitation, not to beg, but to ask for witnesses. She wanted the world to see what would unfold. On the appointed afternoon, the farmhouse sat in a hush. Dr. Augusto came with a professional presence, and Carmen with a thermos and 5 witnesses, neighbors who remembered Antonio's oddities and were prepared to say so under oath if necessary. The photographer who had knocked on the door of the trailer arrived, but stayed outside, sensing he might only be an instrument of spectacle. Marta hovered like a shadow, her face a map of old guilt and uncertain courage. Rodrigo's swagger had the brittle quality of a man holding a borrowed script. He prepared a small flourish, a lawyer's letter that claimed the family had the right to survey the land and that any items found were considered co-owned until formal partition. Dr. Sylvia, seated like a queen in a small chair, produced a packet that included the renunciation paper. Her smile was practiced, her voice a pleasant blade. "You don't have to make this hard," she said to Maria, as if she were offering a kindness. "Sign this, and we will take care to ensure you have a comfortable allowance. There's no need to distress yourself with legal battles." The room smelled, faintly, of coffee and perfume, and the sense of an audience awaiting a verdict. Maria listened. For a moment, the old ache of being judged and diminished rose in her chest like a cold tide. Her fingers found the map in her apron and tightened around it. She did not answer with fury. She answered with the steady voice of someone who had spent nights cataloging truth. "I have found what belonged to my husband," she said simply. "There are appraisals and a note in his own hand. I will not be bullied into signing away rights that I have not given." Dr. Sylvia's smile thinned. "Legal claims can be messy," she replied. "We prefer to keep things simple. You must understand how complicated partition and valuation can be." At that, Dr. Augusto rose. He had not raised his voice yet, but his presence carried a courtroom's gravity. He spoke of evidence, of the seriousness of forgery as a criminal act, and of the duty of all parties to preserve items and documents until a judge or mediator could determine ownership in a proper forum. He gently reminded Rodrigo that pushing someone into signing under pressure could itself be cause for legal action. Rodrigo sneered at formality. He had grown used to bending formality to his convenience. But when Dr. Augusto asked to examine the renunciation, to verify the signature against municipal records, something in the room shifted. The paper that had been poised as an instrument of control became a question that demanded a precise answer. Dr. Augusto requested a short delay, time for a handwriting verification, and to confirm witness signatures. Dr. Sylvia agreed with a thin politeness, perhaps confident she had more cards than she had yet shown. The family left the meeting with quiet assurances, like a storm that has not yet unleashed wind. That night, Maria slept better than she had in weeks. She had chosen a path of method. She had refused to be small. The map lay folded next to her bed like an unread sermon. In the morning, she found a neighbor on the porch, Marta, who had come with stew and a pair of old photographs. Her fingers trembled as she placed them on the table. "Marta," Maria said. The name felt different now, not a default of relationship but the proper address of a person who had once been important in her life. Marta's eyes were wet. "I did not know," she whispered. I think I suspected something, but I was ashamed to look. I'm sorry." A lifetime of small betrayals often wears itself out thin. Apologies can be both a beginning and a small closing. Maria accepted the stew and the apology with a compassionate firmness. She needed witnesses, but she also needed a heart that could be honest. Marta's hands stayed in her lap. They did not reach to steal. Days passed in work and waiting. There were small victories. An appraisal confirmed the value of some stones. The retired foreman signed an affidavit explaining Antonio's habit of hiding items on the property. There were small defeats. The municipal inspector asked for more paperwork and deadlines tightened. Dr. Augusto moved with the patience of someone threading a needle through a fabric that would not be tugged too quickly. Then Dr. Sylvia produced the thing that might have broken the case. A notarized deed that declared certain assets to be renounced by Maria, accompanied by a signed statement from an elderly neighbor who, she claimed, had witnessed Maria's supposed renunciation months earlier. The statement was specific. It named a date and an alleged meeting at which Maria had signed. For an instant, the world for Maria skidded. The paper smelled of a neat finish. Dr. Augusto took the packet and read it as if it were a book. He did not yet show his hand. "We suspected this could happen," he said softly. "I'll have to have it examined." He brought in a handwriting analyst and asked a friend at the registry office to check the paper's stamp. They discovered what careful people discover: pressure marks inconsistent with an original signatory, a stamp that had been used outside its usual sequence, a witness who did not recall the meeting. These were not dramatic revelations that make movies roar. They were the quieter, grayer signs that a document had been manufactured to look honest. When he called Dr. Sylvia to question the provenance of the papers, she responded with armor. "We have clients who are anxious to settle this," she told him. "If this becomes a circus, we will move for a speedy partition through the courts." Dr. Augusto answered with clarity. "If your documents are what they seem to be, and if they're genuine, we will accept appropriate legal processes. But if those documents are forged, we will bring the forgeries to the attention of the authorities. Forgery is a crime." Silva's voice, tight as a violin string, implied a threat. In return, Dr. Augusto calmly arranged to have everything lodged with the prosecutor's office for investigation. He never raised words of vengeance. He raised facts. Facts are the instruments of law, slow and patient. The community watched as the story seeped into gossip. Some defended Rodrigo's right to protect the family estate. Others bristled at the hard recreational cruelty of handing a grieving widow a trailer and a key. The town conversations were like clouds, moving and reforming. Some people's sympathies shifted like weather. In the courtroom that would later convene, there was a small, decisive moment that changed the tenor of everything. Dr. Sylvia presented the renunciation and the statements as proof of the family's claim to parts of the estate. She then produced, as if from a magician's hat, a series of bank documents, withdrawals and transfers she suggested had been made by Antonio to family members in his last year, implying that assets were indeed dispersed in ways that made the family's case plausible. The evidence, however, had been placed in context by Dr. Augusto, who had methodically shown that the bank's registered transfers were to pay off gambling debts or to settle loans in questionable order. The illusion that the family had been recipient of benevolence crumbled when the ledger and the note were read together. Antonio had, in truth, been siphoning away small sums, sometimes into debts that he could not reconcile, sometimes into a private hoard that he intended as a secret bed of security for Maria. The bank's records, Dr. Augusto argued, showed not generosity by the family, but a pattern of transactions that raised questions. Where did the money come from, and who had benefited while the man who had kept the treasure in secret had also been losing control? Under cross-examination, Dr. Sylvia's witness, who had signed the renunciation, revealed gaps in her memory. The handwriting expert testified that the signature bore inconsistencies consistent with copying. The municipal clerk confirmed that the official stamp on the renunciation had been used on days when the alleged meeting never took place. When the foreman from Antonio's younger years took the stand, his testimony was plain and humane. He described a man who liked to hide things like a child hides apples for winter, out of a need to keep rather than a plan to rob. He described how nobody had the right, simply by fiat, to decide what the man wanted after he was gone. Rodrigo, watching the proceedings, lost an armor piece at a time. His arrogance had been a shield. In court, facts are hammers. He had expected the law to be malleable, but truth resisted polishing. The most wrenching moment in the courtroom was not legal, but human. A bank statement, mundane, clinical, appeared in the bundle of evidence Dr. Augusto presented. The paper, folded small, listed withdrawals to accounts whose names shook like small leaves. It revealed transfers to a betting house in the city and notes of debts covered by purchases and money transfers in hurried increments. There was also a typed receipt for a transfer to a man who had been known, in town, as someone Antonio visited on moonlit nights. When the note Antonio had left in the box was read aloud, a voice small and human, a man saying he was sorry for the nights he had stolen from their days, there was a sudden hush. The apology was a small, bright blade that cut the room's air. For Maria, it was a terrible relief. For Rodrigo, it was a rebuke he had not expected. Antonio's confession did not excuse the pain he had caused, but it explained why the secret hoard had existed. The family's attempts to reshape the story as a tidy partition were unmasked, not in one dramatic blow, but in a sequence of small, unhopeful facts. The forged renunciation was declared suspect. An investigation into document tampering was opened. The municipal inspector's earlier condemnation notice was withdrawn, pending the court's determination. The gemstones and documents remained sealed evidence under the court's order. Rodrigo's indignation boiled into something raw and unsoftened. In private, he demanded restitution, not for what had been lost, but for his narrative of hurt. In public, he offered half-answers and practiced sorrow. Beatrice posted a long, vague note about family healing. Marta came to the court with an expression that had the look of someone remembering a face she had known and not recognized. Maria's victory was not quick nor absolute. Courts take time, investigations take even longer. But the scales were no longer tilted automatically in Rodrigo's favor. The town watched as the man who had handed a wife a trailer was required to justify himself under the light of scrutiny. For those who had once laughed at the idea that small people could turn the page on a family's interior economy, the slow motion of the law was education. When the judge issued a provisional ruling to preserve the items and to appoint a curator for the estate pending final settlement, it felt like a breath drawn after long holding. The judge's order did not distribute the treasure to Maria. It did not return her decades of care to her. It did prevent anyone from recklessly removing what had been found. It created a space where truth might be weighed more carefully than a family's version of convenience. The media, delayed as asked, eventually ran a story that laid out the sequence without the sensationalism the journalist had feared. It was careful, factual, and human in tone. There were interviews with neighbors, with Dr. Augusto, and even with a reluctantly remorseful Marta, who admitted she had not wanted to see what she might find if she looked too closely at her son's ambitions. The shifts that followed were gradual but deep. Rodrigo's social standing dampened. People who had once applauded his decisive behavior now spoke of the hurt he had caused, of the cruelty in assuming a woman's life could be handed off like a gift. He found, to his irritation, that some doors closed when he knocked. The family dinners where he had once sat with a loud satisfaction became thin and awkward. Beatrice's practiced features wore the shadow of someone who had learned that victory purchased with small lies tastes of ash. Marta moved differently. One Sunday she came to the trailer without announcement and sat on the sagging porch steps. She held Maria's hands and said simple things, apologies, memories, a request for forgiveness that had the honest hesitation of someone learning new ground. Maria listened. The past was not a smooth surface to be sanded. It was a house that had burned in parts and needed careful rebuilding. What mattered is not that they were wrong, Maria said quietly one day, to Carmen and to Marta and to the others who had shown up to knit the edges. What matters is that we are right now. There is a life to be made. There is justice to be shaped. The moment of public confrontation that the title promised came not as vengeance, but as a turning. The family meeting in which Maria revealed the boxes and the ledger, the court's involvement, the exposure of forged documents. But more dramatically, there was a small scene in which Rodrigo repeated to a friend, in a fit of private cruelty, the line he had once lobbed at Maria with a sneer. "Take the trailer. It's all you deserve." He did not say it into the courtroom. He said it later to a confidant, as if affirming a self-made myth. When it reached Maria, through testimony and overheard conversations, it became less a taunt and more an emblem. She walked to the trailer one afternoon, the stones packed now under court-ordered custody, and stood on the sagging porch looking at a past that had tried to define her. "What they gave me," she said aloud to no one in particular, "was less than a life. What I found beneath my feet was more than I expected." She refused to let the stones be a personal windfall. The discovery had given her something more complex: agency. She drew up plans in a notebook with a steadiness she had once used to mark the days of sewing and grocery lists. She thought of the widows in town with cold dishes and colder rooms, of women who had stood at kitchen tables and been told a life could be reduced to a key and a trailer. She thought of how dignity is often redistributed not by law alone, but by the acts of people who choose to help. With counsel from Dr. Augusto, and under the court's guidance, Maria formed a foundation. Institut Recomeçar, Restart Institute, a name that spoke plainly of second chances. The institute's stated purpose was to provide temporary shelter, vocational training, legal advice, and a community kitchen for widows and abandoned women in rural areas. It would not be an instant solution to the town's inequities. It would be a structured attempt to create lasting change. She insisted on a governance structure that included female neighbors, community leaders, and a small board with transparent accounting. She refused to be the sole face of an organization financed by contested goods. She wanted the work to be public and accountable, to avoid the very secrecy that had trapped Antonio and then almost trapped her. The court approved the institute's legal status while investigations continued, and an independent auditor confirmed that the initial funds, secured under court supervision, would be used according to a transparent plan. The scale of the institute grew slowly. At first, there was only a room converted from the trailer, cots, a donated sewing machine, a small library of how-to books, and a respected volunteer who taught bookkeeping basics. Then, with more formal backing and careful publicity, donations came. A local grocer offered staples monthly. A retired schoolteacher volunteered to teach reading and arithmetic. A carpenter donated benches. Some family members surprised the town. Marta, guilt softened into resolve, volunteered one morning to sort donated clothing. Beatrice came once, awkwardly at first, and later returned to teach a workshop on homemaking skills. Though her motives were complicated, the women in the institute learned a new craft, and she learned how to be useful without domination. Rodrigo, never entirely repentant, offered to help with renovations, his pride softened by exposure and the steady gaze of a community that now watched what he did. There were those who could not bear to look. Some relatives moved away or kept their distance. But the work of the Institute was not about punishing individuals. It was about reshaping a social contract that had allowed humiliation to be a neat instrument in a family drama. The transformation of the trailer into a hub was especially poignant. Once a symbol of disgrace, it became a place where women learned to stitch a blouse, to draft a small business plan, to read a notice from a municipality without shrinking. Maria presided over it with a quiet that never turned into triumphalist glee. When a grant made it possible to build a small community kitchen, she said, "We cook for each other now. That is a kind of dignity." In time, the Institute organized workshops on legal rights for older women, inviting Dr. Augusto to give plain talks about how to keep documents safe and how to seek help when facing manipulative relatives. They hosted a weekly memory circle where older women told stories about their life's work, which younger women recorded to preserve family histories that might otherwise be erased. The public reaction was a complicated tapestry. Some praised Maria as a model of resilience. Others criticized the media attention as intrusive. Maria learned how to take compliments simply and to deflect praise to her volunteers and neighbors. She insisted on a governance model that refused to let charity become spectacle. As for the legal case, it settled slowly. The court eventually recognized her right to a portion of the estate, and the contested items were cataloged and transferred under the trust deed of the Institute. The forgeries were noted, and the prosecutor's office filed charges against those who had tampered with the documents. The outcome of criminal proceedings took longer to resolve, but the avenue of accountability was open. In the end, the most striking change was not a financial one, but a moral and communal recalibration. Maria's life did not become a tale of instant wealth. The stones did not erase the nights she had stood at the stove with a hollowed chest. But they became a tool for making enduring goods. A small shelter, legal advice for a woman terrified by bureaucracy, a sewing circle where laughter returned. Marta's transformation was perhaps the most complex. She became a regular at the Institute, her hands always busy counting threads or folding linens. She found ways to make amends that were practical rather than performative. She arranged a weekly visit schedule for other elderly neighbors, making sure the elderly women had someone to call when the light bulb blew out or when the heating failed. Her eyes carried a steady humility, no clean absolution, but a slow and honest labor. Rodrigo's life changed in subtler layers. He was not paraded as a villain on every corner, though. In private, he bore a social cost for his actions. He volunteered, at Maria's request, in the Institute's renovations on a day when the carpenters were understaffed. His presence there felt like someone at a handrail, adjusting to a new gate. He did not apologize grandly. He made small contributions and learned to listen. Not all wounds fully healed. Some relationships remained awkward. Trust is not an object to be returned like a ring. Yet the pattern in the town shifted. The language used around widows changed. The way disputes were handled grew more procedural and less theatrical. People who had once lineated their affections by ownership discovered that dignity could not be purchased by a signature. Months later, on a raw morning that smelled faintly of rain and baking bread, Maria walked the long lane to the small plot where the trailer stood. The unit had been repaired carefully and had a plaque by the door, a small, unassuming nameplate that read, Institut Recommissar, Community Hub. Children's laughter spilled from inside. Women bussed tables with competent hands. A poster on the wall announced the next legal clinic and a knitting circle. She stood on the porch for a long time, The place that had once sent her out into humiliation now pulsed with the everyday business of making life bearable. The wind moved through the sagging eaves with a softer tone. Carmen, who had been there in the first weeks, joined her, and they both looked out at the field. "Remember the key?" Carmen asked, smiling. Maria reached into her pocket and took it out, the small, rusty key that had begun the whole story. It was dull now, rubbed by years and use. She had considered keeping it like a relic. Instead, she handed it to a young volunteer who locked and unlocked the Institute's storeroom each morning. "You deserve to open things with it," she told her, a small joke that made the volunteer laugh and the room fill with a lightness Maria had not thought possible inside her chest. The sun divided the field into stripes of warmth and shadow. For a moment, she let herself trace the line of her life from those first hurtful words, "Take the trailer. It's all you deserve," to the present, where the trailer was an engine of small mercies. Her achievement, she knew, did not erase grief. It made something different, a legacy that might outlive grudges and poor choices. She had chosen not to weaponize the treasure. She had chosen public service over private triumph. The stones had not been a magic cure, but a resource to set new things in motion. A shelter, a law clinic, a community center that remembered women like her. That choice was its own moral victory. In the evening, as the Institute's first small annual fundraising supper wound down, Marta stood up and spoke to the gathered neighbors, volunteers, and a few carefully invited officials. She confessed briefly and honestly to errors and to the way shame had kept her from looking. She pledged to continue working at the Institute. There were small tears and polite applause. Maria listened, not needing to speak. She had already spoken plenty through action. Later, walking home beneath a broad sky, she felt the slow ease of someone whose life was no longer being narrated by others. The stones under the trailer were now in a trust that paid scholarships for vocational courses. The ledger had become a teaching tool for accounting workshops. The legacy of secrecy had turned into a scaffold for transparency. There are endings that polish life into a neat moral. This was not one of them. There were continuing hearings, lingering resentments, and days when the memory of Antonio's absences returned sharp and lonely. But there were also breakfasts served to women who had once been hungry, and workshops that taught them how to write a simple legal note. Years later, Maria walked the lane at dawn, her pace steady, a scarf around her neck, the trailer softened by new paint and curtains that rustled in a wind, cleansed by many small repairs. She paused by the porch, the place where the key had first struck wood, with an ordinary clank. Children played nearby. A woman she had helped once waved. She thought of the man who had told her what she deserved. Rodrigo's phrase no longer had the power it once had. It had become, to her, an old bell tolling in a past that could not be returned. She touched the rail with a kind of grateful exhaustion. The trailer was no longer a sentence. It had become a threshold. Maria Benedita had been humiliated in public. She had been left with a key and a suitcase and little else. What followed was not a fairy tale of sudden riches, but a hard, patient work, unearthing truth, gathering witnesses, enduring courtrooms, constructing an institution that would outlast personal grievances. In that quiet, as the sun rose and the day took the shape of ordinary tasks, Maria allowed herself a small, steady smile. The treasure had changed things, yes, but the real change was how she used what she had found. She had built a place where dignity could be learned again. She had turned the secret economy of one life into a communal resource. She had refused vengeance and chosen a stubborn kindness that demanded accountability without becoming cruelty. As the town stirred, the trailer behind her hummed with the sound of people making meals, making lists, making plans. The Institute Recommissar had become, in a way, the practical answer to an insult, a living proof that what a person is deserved can be rewritten by action, law, and community. And so she walked on, leaving the porch behind, the map folded in a drawer, the ledger digitized and shared among those it was meant to protect. She had been given a trailer and a word. She had found under her floorboards a fortune that was neither an escape nor a cure, but a new beginning. That beginning, built on evidence, patience, and a refusal to let humiliation define her, was the treasure she kept giving away, a little at a time, until it changed the lives of others as it had changed hers. If this story moved you, consider subscribing for more true-life dramas and sharing it with someone who might need to hear that dignity can be reclaimed.